So today in our webinar, we have two presenters. We have Dr. Mark Norton, who will provide some results from his mixed species research, and Greg Condon, who's a private agronomist who will share his experiences within industry, focusing on the why and what of companion mixes. So firstly, Mark, if you'd like to start sharing your screen, I'll just introduce people to Mark for those of you who don't know him. Dr. Mark Norton is a pasture and crop scientist with over 30 years of research experience in the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries. He has a long-standing interest in the potential to strengthen the stability and resilience of forage production by growing multi-species mixtures rather than being reliant on pasture swards with just one or two species. So I will hand over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Sheena. Okay, so welcome everybody. I'm the leader of a project entitled Mixed Species Annual Fodder Crops to Increase Grazing Animal Production. And it's got a bit of a cast of thousands because we've got both agronomy field experiments, we've got grazing trials, intensive grazing trials, and we've also got so-called on-farm validation research, where we're going on to this year 6 farms across New South Wales and undertaking paired paddock comparisons. So it's a big project, and although today I'm only going to be talking about one of them, one aspect of the project, I should say, and these are the so-called field mixture evaluation agronomy trials. Now, they occur at 3 locations: Wagga, Tamworth and Glen Innes, and we ran the first set of these trials last year in 2022, and there is currently another set of these trials occurring at each of those locations in this year. I'm going to be talking about only one of them, the 2022 one undertaken at Wagga Wagga. The objectives of the trials are to compare the best strict standard single species forage crop against a range of species mixtures with the aim of identifying good performing mixtures. And the sort of measurements we're undertaking, forage production and botanical composition at each of the harvests that we'll undertake. At each of those harvests, we're also looking at forage nutritive value. Clearly, we're interested in the number of harvests which we're able to get from at each time that we want to harvest, and we're looking at, of course, with interest at quality as it varies throughout the season too. And our aim is also to identify any problems, any issues with growing mixtures, because let's face it, this is a new technology, and in many ways we're still searching out what the best ways of doing these are, but we're concerned about problems like weed control, getting as good establishment as we can get. And we're also looking, particularly in southern New South Wales, where it's a bit of a problem, the potential to sow early. How can we sow as early as we would like? Here's just a photograph of a colleague of mine, Peter Tyndall, and he's in a wheat vetch arrowleaf clover forage crop at Urungilly. And I should say that Urungilly is a little locality about 30 k's east of Wagga, and this is where we held the trial last year on the property of Leo Herbert. And this is a shot taken on the 14th of July, and that's exactly a month after the first harvest was taken on at that particular site, that first harvest being the 14th of June. And you can see the regrowth there. Now, the treatments, and I'm sorry, this is a little bit busy, but we've got a number of mixtures here. So treatment 1 was brassica and legume mix, and the brassicas comprise canola, radish, purple top turnip. The legumes comprise vetch and arrowleaf clover. I'll go straight on to treatment 3, where we were looking at a cereal brassica mix, and this was a long season wheat together with canola, radish, and turnip. Treatment 4 was a cereal legume brassica mix, and this was the, the bee's knees. Everything was in there: wheat, cereal, rye, canola, turnip, radish, vetch, and arrowleaf clover. Treatment number 6 is the next one I want to talk about, and that's a cereal legume mix, and that was comprising wheat, vetch, and arrowleaf clover. Then we had a legume mix, treatment 8, which was vetch and arrowleaf clover. Then we had 3 pure swards of brassica, which was just canola, wheat, which was just the cereal, which was just wheat, and the legume, which was just vetch. Now, I've mixed out a couple of these as I've gone along that list there, because in the mixtures containing legumes, we also had a complementary treatment where we added N to each of those 3 mixtures containing legumes. So the brassica legume had N added to it, the cereal legume brassica had N added to it, and the cereal legume had N added to it. So in total, there were 11 treatments. It was sown, I'd have to admit, a little bit later than what we would have really liked, on the 11th of April. But there were in total 44 plots, and they were randomized in a randomized complete block design. And here I've just got very quickly the sowing rates and the names of the cultivars used in each of the different treatments. You can see the rates there. So for example, the pure sward cereal wheat was sown at 75. Look, I'm not going to go through them all, but if you're interested, this will be recorded, so you can go back and look at those rates in detail later on. To say something about the soils, we did a pre-sowing characterization of the soils at this particular site. Colwell phosphorus in the 0 to 10 centimetre profile, as you can see there across each of the 4 reps, quite high, 45, ranging from 44 through to 59 milligrams per kilogram, really quite high in the 0 to 10. Total carbon, not particularly high, ranging from about 1.2 through to 1.4%. Effective cation exchange capacity, again, relatively low, ranging from 6.3 up to 7 centimoles per kilogram. To say something about soil profile, pH in the soil profile, and you'll note that I've divided it up into 5 centimetre segments there, so that we can look at what's in a bit more detail than what the 0 to 10 sample would give you. We can look at what's going on in terms of pH down that profile. So in the 0 to 5, it looks really quite good, doesn't it? 5.2 through to 5.4. But then, lo and behold, you go down to between 5 to 10, we've dropped down, particularly in rep 3 and rep 4, down to 4.7. So that's quite a drop. The 10 to 15 centimetre profile, we're even down to 4.6 pH. This is all in calcium chloride in rep 3. And you'll notice with interest that it has tended to go up somewhat in the 15 to 20, back up to 5.4 in rep 2. But yeah, that's that relatively acidic layer between 5 and 15 centimetres. And the last thing I want to talk about, which is important to mention in the context of this trial, is bulk density. And we took it down to 60 centimetres, but the thing that I particularly wanted to mention to you was the relatively high bulk density in the 0 to 10 centimetre profile, 1.51 grams per cubic centimetres, pretty tight. Okay. Now, something about fertilizer and harvest management. As a basal fertilizer, we applied the product Crop Lift at 80 kilograms a hectare, and this is a product containing 15% N, 12P, and 12S. And after the second harvest, of all plots received 50 kilograms of Gran-Am, which is a product containing 20% N, 24% S. And the plus N treatments also received 50 kilograms of urea at those times. And that application was applied again after the fourth harvest. The chief criterion for determining harvest time would be an evaluation of whether there was sufficient forage for a producer to open the gates and let his animals in to graze. For harvest, we undertook calibrated visual assessments of yield and botanical composition using the program Botanal. And at the same time, we also took grab samples to determine nutritive value, and these were taken from all the plots. To say something about the weather that we experienced during the trial. Okay, so the grey bars are rainfall. You can see them spread out there across the year. And just forgive me because I'm going to refer to my notes so that I don't miss out anything really important. Where are we? Sorry. Okay. Normally the rainfall of Wagga from June to early December, which was the time when this trial occurred, is 356 millimetre, the average rainfall. However, last year it was substantially greater than this, 490 mils. The first couple of months, as you can see there, were relatively dry. We only had in total about 26 mils. But after that, August, September, October, November, every month, except November, which was still 95 millimetres, but every month, well, we had 100 in August, 106 in September, and 164 in October. November had 95. So maximum and minimum temperatures weren't radically different from what you might expect. But one thing to note was that the high incidence of rainfall over the spring meant that there was relatively small amount of, well, the amount of solar radiation that the crops experienced was somewhat reduced. And this almost certainly had detrimental effects on the amount of production that we saw, particularly in August, as you'll see later on. Okay, look, I want to mention something quickly about establishment plant densities. Okay, because these were important. And this I would have to say to you, brings out one of the problems that people inevitably will experience, or maybe not if they're lucky or very skilled, in undertaking this work. So we had suboptimal cereal establishment. And a key reason for this was that we couldn't get the tines to the depth that we wanted. And that was certainly associated with the tightness of that topsoil, which I showed you before. In terms of brassica legume, you can say that we were much fortunate in getting a reasonable establishment with those ones. But cereals were not particularly optimal, I'll admit. Unfortunately, we didn't get it deep enough. There was quite a lot of seeds still on the ground. Yeah, and in retrospect, we probably should have done a pre-sowing light cultivation beforehand. But, well, we didn't. But anyway, yeah. All right, just to go on, and here are some results. And I know it's busy, but look, just quickly, the three right-hand bars, okay, let me describe this. The first harvest is in the top left-hand corner, the second, the top right-hand. The third, you can see it there, harvest 3 on the 6th of September is in the middle left panel. The fourth, harvest 4 in the middle right panel. The fifth, 28th of October in the bottom right panel, bottom left panel, and the 6th in the bottom right panel. Okay, so the 3 bars to the right on each of the in each of the panels are the pure swords. So the purple is brassica, the black is pure cereal, and the magenta is pure legume. And the ones to the left of that are all mixtures. So the red, there are 2 bars, there's 1 bar in the top 2 ones, because the top 2 harvests there were before we started introducing N. But anyway, subsequently, any red bars, be they solid or be they hatched, are brassica legume mixes. The yellow bar or bars are brassica cereal and legume. The green bars are cereal and legume, and the orange are cereal and brassica. Okay, so just to say something quickly, harvest 1, I'd like to point out to you, the one in the top left-hand corner. Brassicas were quite active then, and particularly turnip and radish, very early, very active in the season. Harvest 2, the vetches started to come into their own, and harvest 3, cereals started getting going too. So that was the black bar that you can see there. Harvest 4, productivity really starts to take off. The cereals are quite highly productive, the black, and the brassica and legume containing mixtures were also high. Harvest 5, the highest yielding harvests are all mixtures. So you can see those on the left hand, right through to the blue one. They were the most highly productive one. The wheat is clearly beginning to finish by harvest 5, which was the 28th of October. And harvest 6, well, the end of season legumes, and particularly arrowleaf clover, was the most active late in the season, maintaining yield. And it's a good one because if moisture is available, it'll just keep on growing. Okay, so this is a way of presenting the results in a different method. And what I've done here is on the bottom axis are the dates of each of the harvests undertaken. There are 6 of them there, as you can see. The blue is brassica, the grey is legume, orange is cereal, and yellow is weed, essentially. So I suppose the thing you can say that I'd most like to represent, and I should point out, the total dry matter is essentially the height of the curve. And of course, the different coloured sections constitute the different amount contributed by the different components. So nevertheless, there's a lot of information there, but what I'd like to point out particularly is the important contribution of the blue, the brassica, early in the season. And down here in southern New South Wales, we're particularly interested in trying to fill that autumn-winter feed gap. So being able to sow early and get that brassica going in some warm soil is an important thing. And I'd admit that we weren't able to sow as early as we would like, but if we had been able to, I would have expected some more brassica to have been there. But anyway, that's what I'd particularly like to harvest, what I'd like to point out now. Okay, so look, just rapidly, a couple of graphs of nutritive value. And so here is megajoule, metabolizable energy. You can see I'm an agronomist, can't you? Metabolizable energy on a hectare basis. And so this is metabolizable energy per kilogram multiplied by biomass yield. And the high early production of the brassicas, and I'd like to point out particularly those points on the extreme left-hand side of the axis, because that down here is what we're facing early. They're doing better than, for example, a cereal legume mix, which is in the bottom right-hand corner here. So we've got more metabolizable energy here from anything containing brassicas in comparison to that without, which is struggling to catch up early in the year. The next one I'd like to show you is crude protein. And as would be expected, there's a general downward trend as the fodder crops mature. And the higher protein is generally very much a factor. And I could point out this bottom left-hand panel to you here, that the more legume you've got in there, the better, the greater the amount of protein there. I'd have to say that with the exception of harvest 3 here and here, we didn't see any advantage of adding extra nitrogen to the sward in those mixtures. So I think the recommendation would be, generally we didn't see anything, so I wouldn't advise you to do it. Okay, now this is the drought supplement, the drought feed calculator, some output from that. And I'd like particularly to draw your attention to the bottom rows, the ones highlighted in yellow. And there I'm comparing brassica with a mixture, brassica, and you'll just have to believe me, B is brassica, C is cereal, L is legume, and across the harvest there, across the 6 harvests. And so, for example, in the first one, we've got a greater dry matter intake from the pure brassica in comparison to the mixture. And similarly, we've got a greater live weight gain in the brassica in comparison to the mixture. It starts to change, though, later on when we see, particularly from, and the 8th of August is not included because the amount of dry matter that we had was just too low to warrant putting it in. But from the 6th of September onwards through to the end, increasingly we had greater intake from the mixtures, and particularly from September onwards, we had greater animal live weight gain too from the mixtures. Some conclusions quickly, if I can get there. If seed placement of all species is the same, the trial, as it was in our case, the trial highlighted the need to sow at an optimal compromised depth. If sowing into a tight seed bed, it's probably a good idea to think about a pre-sowing cultivation to achieve optimal sowing depth. Of course, that's got problems in terms of what you might achieve in terms of losing moisture. Anyway, it's best to sow without doubt as early as possible to maximize yield of the brassicas, no later than the end of March, I would say. And particularly in South Central New South Wales, stubble conservation is crucial for moisture conservation. And on account of that, many of our producers down here are using disc openers. If you're sowing, as you probably will, seed of species with substantially different seed sizes, then it's certainly a good idea to use different seed boxes to hold them, to keep them separate. I think we can say, in terms of summarising the results, when soil moisture is non-limiting and the season is long, fodder crop mixtures with species of different growth rhythms are certainly advantageous. And mixtures containing brassicas were shown to be helpful in terms of overcoming the autumn-winter feed gap. And so that's the end of what I'd like to say. And if you've got some questions later on, and there's not the opportunity to mention it now, I'd be happy to get some emailed questions, and there's my email address. So thank you.
Thank you, Mark. So Greg, many of you may know, is with Grassroots Agronomy, his own consultancy business based in southern New South Wales near Junee. He works as an independent agronomist with family and corporate farming operations, and in partnership with his wife, Kiralee, the business provides a range of technical and business advice related to winter grains and sheep production. There is a strong focus around profitable farming systems and its associated agronomy. So Greg's also engaged with Weed Smart as an extension agronomist for New South Wales. So he delivers practical solutions for growers and industry on weed management. So Greg, welcome, and I will hand over to you to go through your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Sheena, for the opportunity, and thanks to Mark and Helen for being included in this project. It's good to see some funding come from bodies like MLA and others to quantify what's happening in the paddocks. So Helen and I have been talking about this for a few years, and then Mark also was, I guess, included in discussions around what growers are already doing and actually sort of getting a greater understanding about the implications for livestock production systems, which the DPI really, this last year of research has been fantastic to quantify not only what the dry matter, or the quality of the dry matter is, but also how that's influencing livestock systems. So from our perspective, we've got huge adoption of these companion mixes in our local area for a range of reasons, which I'll talk about. Vetch sort of underpins that, so that's sort of that legume component. But as Mark was talking about, the brassicas and the cereals are critical as well to provide a bit of balance for the livestock. And a few other functions as well. So I'll go through, I guess, the companion mixes in the farming systems for this region. So as we've had great success. We've had 3 wet seasons, and even prior to the wet seasons we've had recently, even in 17, 18, 19, growers are still adopting these forage options. So really sort of wanting to sort of fit them into mixed farming systems, but are also seeing their adoption in continuous cropping. So that's a fairly heavy clay soil type to the west of Ganmain towards Narrandera, where early sown vetch companion mix got away from the livestock because it was quite wet, but just shows you the potential of the biomass when we have these favourable seasons. I guess the underpinning thing that we want to remind, and I'll talk about, is perennial pasture. So we just can't forget the value that perennial pasture has. We know what lucerne does in our farming systems, but also fescue, phalaris and annuals. So they're sort of the key basis of mixed farming for particularly breeding enterprises, but those that those that might do trading as well. So that's still number one as a forage option on these businesses. And then we look at the traditional dual purpose crops, which New South Wales DPI has championed the use of for many years with winter wheats initially, and then we've seen work by CSIRO from John Kierkegaard and his team with the winter canola. So the objective of the dual purpose crop is to have grazing in the winter. Generally that's a monoculture species that is then locked up for biomass recovery post-grazing, and that goes through to harvest. So that proves very sort of successful in sort of the eastern medium rainfall zone and then the high rainfall zone. So I guess oats is probably the original benchmark in that space, but we've seen wheat and canola really take up the slack as well. So introduce a third forage mix, and this is the companions. So what Mark's been talking about with the brassica, the vetch, the wheat, and even clovers. So the idea that this came about was, I guess, growers sort of trialling, vetch and oats has been around for a long time, but sort of trialling where they can sort of use these different mixes for grazing, and then they have the option to either brown manure them for cleaning up weeds or storing soil moisture, but also they could take them through to hay or silage, which was, again, something that was done in the past with silage or hay options. So what's it actually involved? So I'll talk about a little bit more detail about the what of these forage mixes. And then probably the question most of you are asking is why? Why do we bother looking at these companion forage mixes when I've already highlighted 2 other pretty proven, I guess, forage mixes in terms of perennial pastures and also the dual purpose crops. So there is a reason, and that's how I guess grower adoption has influenced the reasoning behind some of these mixes being used quite widely in medium rainfall zones. So I guess perennial pastures are the benchmark. We just can't forget this. So that's all these strategies we're using around the companion mixes are complementary. So we're aiming to complement what the perennial pasture does, because we just know how reliable they are. We can get a mix of diverse species like lucerne, clover, grasses. They're proven with years of research and grower adoption for breeding systems, for trading systems, for stabilising soils, for improving soil carbon. So that's truly proven. And those roots are drawing on deep moisture and nutrients, and they supply sheep, for feed for sheep and cattle. They can fix nitrogen, they build soil organic carbon and improve soil structure. So A key thing with perennial pastures that can't be forgotten is we're only sowing them every 6 to 10 years, and some of our perennial grass mixes we're even longer than that. So we're aiming to get a really long return on investment with a good managed perennial pasture of 10 plus years, and that can't be forgotten and that sort of comes back to managing that ground cover, but that is still underpins a lot of the feed base on a mixed farming system. I guess stepping into these companion mixes, I guess the way we've looked at it is we're aiming to mimic that pasture base that we talked about, so with a little bit of diversity for the benefit of the livestock, but also want a purpose. So it can be a bit cash flow free when people start putting grazing crops in and just leave the stock on them at the end of the year to graze out. We've actually said that there's no return from that in comparison to a perennial pasture or in comparison to a cash crop. We actually want to have a purpose for growing these companion mixes, and that's why the growers have really looked quite hard at the systems that they've adopted them in. So you've got a photograph there. You can just see the mix where we've got some tillage radish, some vetch, some cereal, and some purple top turnip. You've got that early establishment on the left that Mark's talking about. We have a purpose at the end of the year as to where they end up. So we want to feed livestock through the winter, fix some nitrogen if we're sort of in a mixed farming system to supply nitrogen for subsequent crops, and then potentially clean up weeds for the crops that might come in subsequent years. So I really want to emphasise that. Have a purpose for growing a companion mix. Don't just put them in for, you really need the livestock intensity to justify the expenditure, but also an end of season result. As Mark mentioned quite a few times, that early sowing is critical for success. So if we want to basically lengthen the pasture growth curve, which is the objective of most grazing crops, so when our perennial pastures go into a period of lower biomass production, we want to sort of extend that with grazing crops that generally grow a lot quicker. So early sowing has been critical, and the adoption within our client group has sort of proven that. So you've got a grower there, Rob Hart from locally at Junee. So that's a Bennett wheat stubble from 2020. He was sowing a vetch mix into that. That's in the first week of March. So it was actually, there was moisture at the surface, but we hadn't had rain for a little while. And the objective with that, what Rob's doing and other growers are doing, is to get that grazing crop in early, get it up. So we've got feed available for sheep in sort of that early part of winter, which normally wouldn't, as those perennial pastures are tailing off. So that's a really important part. And as we have some seeders that are set up to get through that level of stubble to retain that surface moisture, and that's having confidence to do it well. That's probably the other thing the growers have really found, that they've got good machinery set up to retain that stubble, accurate seed placement, which can be a bit of a challenge with large seeded species and small seeded species. But generally, as Mark made a good comment on that compromise between going too deep and too shallow. But generally, the program has sort of been met with success when they focus on, for example, with a sharp disc or a tine that's going in minimal stubble burdens that can get that seed placed quite accurately. So a lot of this work locally has been done. The growers have been looking at these systems for well over 10 years now, but largely the adoption's really accelerated in the last 3 to 4 years. It's all been based around sheep systems, so finishing, breeding, largely an opportunity for producers to turn animals off at higher weight gains than what they would get off some of their perennial pastures in that period between winter and spring, whilst also trying to fix nitrogen for the subsequent cropping phases. But cattle, a little bit more care is warranted. So with the high legume mixture in the species, so with cattle, you need to warrant looking after some of their blight risk that can be associated with it, but certainly well and truly proven with sheep in these mixed species. We have tweaked the mix a bit. Mark went through some of the options available. I guess the brassicas do the early season dry matter. It's really good to see the results from the trials at Urungilly last year, quantifying what we observed in the paddock. The brassicas do it early, the cereals sort of come into it after that, and then the legumes finish off the end of the season with that sort of late spring flush if available. So we've seen tweaking go on where growers have started out with just a vetch cereal brassica mix, and then we've adjusted things like clovers or cereal rye, depending on soil type or grazing systems. So it's ongoing, and it's not completely right, and it would be adjusted depending on your location in central New South Wales, southern New South Wales, or northern Victoria. So there are tweaks to the mix that are ongoing, but we generally maintain integrity around the pulse or the legume component, because that's really important in these mixes to create a legacy for the following crops. So this is a well-known pasture growth curve from the ProGraze manual, which people would be familiar with. So we know the standard growth curve, that little bit of a bump in dry matter production through the autumn, and then you have a winter I guess, drop off in production with short days and cold temperatures, but then you get that spring flush. So what the winter wheat and the grazing crops have allowed us to do is really push that growth curve much earlier. So we're getting more dry matter through that winter period with the winter wheat, which historically we weren't getting from the pastures. But we also know that the forage or the companion mixes are producing a lot better mix of species with the diversity, rather than just looking at a monoculture. So those two critical times in sort of May, June, and then again at that sort of August, September, depending on the livestock system that producers have really suited the adoption of some of these forage mixes on mixed farms in southern and central New South Wales. So that's still a really important thing to go back to and revisit as a producer on your place as to where that growth curve fits. So why companion mixes? Why have people sort of adopted them as readily as they have? Here's a photograph from the southern Monero in the Bombala delegate area. The Jeffrey family up there have bought the companion mixes in as a part of their cropping phase to extend, I guess, grazing windows for the livestock system they're running. Locally, we just sort of see it's the ability to sow a portion of the crop area quite early, and often people are sowing them dry, and that allows them to retain stubble and get crops up on marginal moisture. It's generally too early for their main season canola sowing program, so that's sort of a good opportunity to get some proportion of the crop sown early. We're sort of looking at a decline. This is a little bit away from the livestock side of things, but looking at a decline in grain pulses, given their risk and price issues. So like lupins are a classic example. We've grown lupins for a long time, southern New South Wales. People are replacing the lupins with these companion mixes based on the vetch as their legume source. There's lower risk, and we have a number of growers who no longer grow grain pulses to harvest because they've found so much success with these companion mixes, and it actually warrants, there's no need for grain storage for sort of growing wheat and canola that's delivered into the system, or they do the forage mixes, which is generally spray fallout at the end of the season. A bit of a catch cry on the basis of the rotation work being conducted by New South Wales DPI and CSIRO is that weeds, water and N. So if we talk about purpose, we want purpose from these companion mixes, and one is the ability to control weeds, particularly resistant ryegrass is a classic. We can store some water for next year's canola or cereal, whatever's following, but also is the accumulation of biological N. So that's a massive kick. So we actually tick 3 boxes all in one with this inclusion in the rotation. And as Mark and his team are finding, it's actually a really balanced forage for sheep and cattle, rather than just putting them on monoculture species, which we don't do in a pasture sense. So this does make some sense from a forage grazing mix perspective, that you've got a mix of different species that tend to balance some of the metabolic issues that can come up in wintertime, for example. And there are some anecdotal observations around an improvement in soil structure from the taprooted bulbous species and the ability to fix ends. So the soil side of it is really important as well. Just some actual data. So rather than just talking all the time about anecdotal evidence from growers, we see the inclusion of Vetch in the GRDC farming systems trial site from Urana. So if you look at the brown box, that's the yields where they grow, or the average annual growth canola yield, following a barley canola wheat rotation. And then you look at the incremental addition of different legumes into that. And then the highest kick is coming from a Vetch canola wheat system. So that's a Urana in a relatively medium rainfall zone, so there's an extra 700 kilos per hectare of canola from that system. But what that's not telling us is all the indirect benefits. So we talked about this with Helen pre sort of the webinar. So you've got the extra legacy of nitrogen that will last through to the next wheat crop. You've got double break value from minimising crown rot. But the big kick that comes from controlling resistant ryegrass in that vetch phase. So that's in its 6-year of trials. That will hopefully continue for another round of funding. But it's pretty exciting to see the legacy effect of something like these crops, these companion crops like vetch for following crop types like canola and wheat. So I guess with the Weed Smart role I have, we sort of focus around weed management from a Big Six focus. So I guess the key part is looking at not just herbicides, but we all think our weed management revolves around herbicides. Integrated weed management from Weed Smart comes from a range of different tactics. So diverse rotations is what underpins a lot of that. And if you can see the double knock, the crop competition, the stopping seed set, mix and rotate, and then harvest weed seed control generally follow. But the rotation is what underpins the basis of all our farming systems. And that's where these companion mixes, again, have such a huge role to play in managing some of those more difficult weeds, particularly glyphosate-resistant ryegrass, which is becoming problematic on a lot of properties in southern regions. So I guess the termination of the mix is a really important thing, and that's I keep coming back to this theme of having a purpose. So this is an example of some clients where the mix wasn't grazed that hard, so they actually used a heavy metal roller to crush the tillage radish at the end of the season, and actually did a really good job terminating the brassicas, and then the vetch and field peas that were underneath is from Wheathallie. So in a more western environment, then allowed the legumes to come back through where they couldn't actually graze it. And then following on from that, this is for another growers last year, with the termination of the mix later in the spring. So we fixed our target nitrogen. We can control the ryegrass and then set it up for the subsequent cropping phase. So that's a little bit different from the core focus of the work here, but from a farming system perspective, we think this is really important, and that's what's driving the adoption of these companion mixes. Their value from the farming systems perspective, not just the livestock benefit. A couple of growers that are adopting these systems in their business. So Hugh and Libby Cruikshank, who are from Rannick, just north of Coolman on the way to Area Park. So they run a mixed farming system. They have merino composite sheep, but the thing for them is the inclusion of that vetch hay or vetch fallow in their business to fix, I guess, that mineral nitrogen for them, and using the companion mixes for their breeding sheep, not only just their growing sheep. So it's been a really, really important inclusion into their rotation for, I guess, lowering that risk and diversity of forages. Moving a bit further north into a higher rainfall zone, the Curry family at Juno Reefs in New South Wales, they run a large-scale sheep operations for around 4,000 merinos. It's seeing the vetch, and they still do some faba beans grown in rotation with their crops. But the vetch mix has been really powerful, and some new properties they've bought in recent years for helping clean up resistant ryegrass. So that's a few producers that have been doing this, some of the earliest adopters. These two families have been doing this for well over eight years now, so it's a really established component of their farming system. So in conclusion, there's a lot happening, and it's really good to hear what Mark and Helen and their team are doing in the research of this emerging sort of forage mix. Ultimately, for me, it's complementing cropping and livestock. So we have a lot of people that want to achieve a lot of different things on their businesses, but this companion mixing ticks a lot of boxes. We're seeing a farming system benefit, and that's the bottom line. So we're helping control those resistant weeds. We're leaving a bit of a residual water, which just hasn't been a huge priority in recent years. That legacy nitrogen, but it's evening out the feed supply. That's a big thing too, particularly when we've got these quite precise seeding systems out there now that can plant crops into marginal moisture quite reliably. But ultimately, it's mitigating risk, and this comes back to how producers can plan how this might fit into your business. So if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to take emails or a phone call. But thanks for the crew for the opportunity today.
Helen, are you able to ask the questions that have come through?
Yes, there was a question on after Mark's presentation about the lack of N response, particularly to the canola mixes. And maybe Greg, considering that Leo is a client of yours. Have you got any comments on what the base and levels in that paddock may have been?
Yeah, so it was a barley stubble, and that had followed wheat the year before, so it was quite low. We didn't actually measure it, but yeah, that's in the surrounding paddock. There was a vetch mix sown, similar to what Mark's trials are looking at. He went in quite a bit earlier, and we saw really good nodulation, even though the soil is moderately acidic at that 5 to 15 centimetres. So yeah, the background soil N level would have been low, to answer your question.
And the lack of response was surprising. Are we continuing that treatment into the 2023?
No, we're not. We're not, because as in the results that I kind of showed you with the plus N treatments, we didn't really see consistent responses at all, and in fact only in a couple of cases out of quite a few did we see any response. So it was considered not worthwhile to continue.
But just on that, because it is, we had a comment recently on Twitter about, so generally commercially the growers do leave N out of it, so they might forego some dry matter, but we really want the vetch to work as hard as possible. So it's sort of the economic side of it. So the brassicas might struggle from a lower end supply, and Mark's trials sort of shown that in the end, from a cash perspective and managing that input cost, we do like to keep the N out of it.
Yes, the added N limits the rhizobia activity.
Yeah, the rhizobia gets lazy. You don't put N on it, it slows down. So we actually want it to work as hard as possible. And it will, the dry matter can be a bit slower earlier, particularly with some of the later sown mixes.
So quite a few questions came through about how growers are handling the different seed sizes that they're sowing in these mixes. What's the general message for you, Greg, if they haven't got the option to use a small seed box or a band seeder? How do you decide which seed size or which crop?
Yes, so we try and mix the two large seeded together, so the vetch and the cereal. So that potentially, most bins will have, most seeders will have two bins. So ideally, put the large seeders.
Not so much in the north.
Oh, right. Yeah. So generally, we like to put the large seeded ones in the front bin and the small seeded ones in the back bin. But if that can't be done, ultimately mixing them all together is very problematic, and probably something for the seed costs involved, something we probably advise people against. If you don't have the correct setup, I think it economically be something that you would not really do. So unless you want to sell it twice, which adds more costs. So I'm really conscious of that. So you want to. And you look at a PJ green bin that could potentially be added that people generally have. If they're sowing pastures, they would have the ability to sow a small seeded mix, I'd expect, on a mixed farm. But if that's not available, then you might need to revisit how mixing, because the small seeds will settle out very quickly when they're mixed with the large seeds.
And on that same bent, what about inoculation? Inoculation of the legumes. How are, particularly with the vetches, a lot of people.
Well, we're double inoculating, Helen, on industry advice, which worked well. So, we're generally being very liberal with the peat inoculant. The clover would get inoculated as well. So that's just done as per best practice, industry practice. So if it's over inoculated, we don't get too worried. But it's just inoculating the vetch quantity and then mixing it with the cereal as it goes into the seeder.
So the other questions related to when the selective grazing, and particularly with the turnips, when livestock starting to attack the tuber. Yeah, it's quite in those mixes.
It's quite seasonal. So we always see when the sheep particularly go into a paddock first, they eat all the ryegrass and the barley grass from around the outside of the paddock and any trees, and then they start on the cereals. They'll eat the cereals next, and then they generally start on the brassicas after that, and that's usually can be up to 6 or 8 weeks after the sheep have actually been in the paddock. So the selection pressure is later for the brassicas, and then once they start on the brassicas, generally the legumes are the last thing to be eaten. So it's the season we've sort of got a good handle on observing the different selectivity, and it doesn't seem to, as Mark's information sort of showed it, which was really good. It didn't seem to make a huge difference on daily weight gain. So they're just selective generally on the time, as they do in a normal mixed pasture. You've got to think about it as a mixed pasture. So they'll eat the grasses at some time of the year, they'll eat the cape weed and the other weeds at a different time of year, and then the cereals and the grasses, or sorry, the cereals and the turnips are a bit similar.
It's interesting, Greg, though, that point. I mean, we've got an on-farm validation site up at Condon at the moment, and interestingly, the farmer up there has told us that, and the animals have only just been put in since late May. You know? The farmer up there has been telling us that the animals have really been going for the turnips and the tubers of the turnips too, first off. So it does seem to vary somewhat from season to season.
Yes. And they'll eventually then pull, particularly, you know, they'll pull the tubers out and chew on the tubers, and it's,
We're going to have to finish up with the questions. Thanks everybody who sent those through. As Mark and Greg
Helen?
Said, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, Helen. Given we've just got a couple of minutes, I do have a couple of other ones that have come directly to me and I haven't been able to forward on. Do you mind if I run through them?
Yes.
So the first one was from Rowan Leach, who asked, do you have a graph of the total dry matter produced across the growing season, coupled with metabolizable energy and crude protein? It would be a great visual.
Look, I can send one to you, Rowan, if that's all right. I have one, yes.
What we propose is there is a handout that's been done that summarises the Urunghili results, and if that's not already in there, we can include that in. We're going to put that on the chat site to make it available to everybody when it's done, ASAP.
Okay, fantastic.
Are there any others coming through that I didn't see?
Yeah, I've got another one from Callum Thompson, which was, what were the soil nitrogen levels like pre-sowing? Was nitrogen limiting in the trial?
No, we discussed that. So it was.
Sorry.
We don't think so. Yeah.
No. Okay. And then two more from Jane. Can you make hay from a companion mix if the mix has included turnip or radish? I've heard the radish turnip can cause moisture problems. Any experience? Thank you.
Yeah, no, we've had a couple of goes at that. And that doesn't work. So generally, if producers, like that example I put up there from Hugh and Libby Cruikshank, if they are planning to do hay from their vetch mixes, they'll leave the turnip out completely. So they'll just do vetch and cereal and clover. But if they're going to graze it for fallow at the end of the season, they'll put the turnips back in. So no, it's a really good point they brought up, that we avoid the brassicas if we want to do hay.
Are they using a conditioner with the veg?
Yep.
For the veg hay?
Yep.
That's also recommended, isn't it?
Yeah.
Cool. And a final one that I have here from Andrew Foster. What's the importance of soil pH when growing vetch? We found a lot of disease problems if pH was low.
I think that the answer to that is that if you're growing any of the pulses in acidic conditions, they're going to be compromised, more susceptible to disease. So yes, vetch is more tolerant than some, but it's still susceptible to low pH.
Okay, thanks, Helen. That's all the questions I had in my box there.
Interesting on the disease, I'll make a comment there, Sheena. So CSIRO have been doing some work at the Greenthorpe site, so where they've been looking at chickpeas and linseed, for example, that companion mix, and that they're sort of having to spray the monoculture chickpeas up to 7-8 times in these wetter years. And we found exactly the same thing with vetch. When we have a monoculture vetch, last year, for example, some of these seed crops, we sprayed them nearly 4 times for botrytis. As soon as we introduce a companion with the vetch, that botrytis is still there, but it doesn't absolutely take over the crop. So there's some sort of, I guess, relationship happening there from a pathological point of view, that the diseases don't take off or have the same impact when we're in a companion mix than when we're in a monoculture. So don't have the answer why, but that's just years of observation. We're sort of really noticing when the vetch is grown in mixtures.
Well, it certainly had a lot to do with the amount of inoculum that's there, you know, and when it's in a mix, there's simply not as much inoculum. Yeah.
So if that's all the questions, what we're going to do is people have asked if we can circulate a copy of the PDF of the presentations. We'll make that available on the chat site as soon as possible. But other than that, Sheena, have you got any more housekeeping? Would you like?
No, I think that's it. Yeah, thank you very much for that, Helen, and thanks everyone for attending from my end. Yeah.
And thank you, Mark and Greg. Both these guys are going to be continuing the work, so you'll be hearing more from this part of the world on what mixed species are doing. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, Una. Thanks, Una.
Yep. Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Mark.